Today, we're embarking on a bit of an adventure, really, through centuries of creativity. We're using excerpts from Michael Alexander's book, A History of English Literature, as our guide.
Yeah, and our mission for this deep dive is, well, to try and cut through what can feel like a pretty overwhelming amount of literary history. Instead of just, listing names and dates.
Right.
We want to pull out the key insights from this particular source. The goal is to give you a sort of foundational map, a sense of what English literature is all about and its historical shape.
Because, let's face it, most people probably know the big names. Shakespeare, Austen, Dickens, maybe Chaucer, Milton, the big peaks in the mountain range, you could say.
Exactly, the landmarks.
But seeing how they actually connect, understanding the landscape around them, the sort of shifting ground they stood on, well, that's where a history like this becomes really valuable, isn't it?
It really is.
It's not about memorizing every single minor poet, but about getting that quicker, thorough understanding and maybe spotting some of those aha moments.
Precisely. It helps you avoid feeling completely lost in the sheer volume of it all. It gives you context, perspective. This deep dive, it's kind of like getting the cheat sheet to understanding not just the books themselves, but also how tastes evolved, how different forms rose and fell, and the enduring ideas that literature carries through time.
Okay, so let's dive right in. A fundamental question first. What do we even mean when we talk about literature? Is it just any old writing?
That's a great place to start because it might seem simple, but the word itself, according to this history, isn't neutral. Literature isn't just any writing. It carries a qualitative implication.
Meaning it's considered better or more important.
Sort of. It suggests a belief that the work has certain lasting qualities, certain merits, and crucially, that those qualities are often best appreciated when you understand the work in its historical context, in its place in the timeline.
Okay, so it's writing that we, as a culture perhaps, have decided is worth remembering, analyzing, looking back on. It has a perceived value that makes it more than, a grocery list or an old newspaper article.
Exactly. And that underlying idea of quality, plus the understanding that it's best appreciated historically, well, that's the whole reason literary history exists,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
It's an attempt to put the most memorable, the most significant English writing into some kind of intelligible perspective.
Which leads to the next big question. Why do we need literary history? Why not just, pick up Shakespeare or Austen and read them?
Well, it's a good question. In today's academic world, things often get incredibly specialized. You have scholars who might spend their entire career on just one author, maybe even a single book.
Right, super focused.
And while that produces amazing, deep insights, sometimes the bigger picture, the larger narrative, can get a bit lost. Literary history provides that crucial general view, that wider perspective.
Ah, okay. It's like needing the map of the whole country, not just, incredibly detailed plans for a few famous cities.
That's a great analogy, yeah. Many learners, like you said, know the landmarks, Shakespeare, Swift, Chaucer, Milton, Eliot, Austen, Dickens, but maybe not much about the context around them, the predecessors, the movements that shaped them.
Or even just when they were writing.
Right. Literary history helps you place writers and works within their centuries and movements. It helps you avoid basic errors like thinking Charles Dickens was an 18th century novelist. The source even quotes Samuel Daniel lamenting way back then, how many thousands never heard the name of Sidney or of Spencer or their books? The problem isn't new.
So it gives you the framework. It helps you see the connections, the evolution, make sense of the vastness. It helps you gain a sense of what English literature actually is.
It really does.
Yeah.
And this particular history, the source we're drawing from, makes a conscious decision about focus. It gives more space, naturally, to major works and authors, the ones generally considered to have the greatest literary interest over time.
So it's focusing on the writing that, for whatever complex reasons, has kind of stood the test of time in terms of its artistic or imaginative quality, rather than, say, its immediate political impact at the time.
Generally, yes. It gives less attention to what's considered minor literature, and even less, perhaps, to writing that might be incredibly important historically or culturally, like pamphlets or everyday documents, but may be seen as weaker purely in terms of literary interest or quality. It assumes the reader likes literature and is curious about its story.
That makes sense, but it also raises a really fascinating question, one the source tackles directly. Are these literary reputations permanent? Once a writer is hailed as great, do they just stay great forever?
Well, the history of taste is humbling, let's say. Very few names are truly oblivion-proof.
Wow.
Looking across the whole Western tradition, the source suggests only 3 are consistently undisputed across the ages: Homer, Dante, and Shakespeare.
Wow. Just 3 out of millennia of writing.
Yeah. And even Homer and Dante were apparently lost to view for certain periods. It really shows how much taste can shift.
That's incredible. It really underscores the point.
It does. And even Shakespeare, who's had pretty continuous acclaim since the theaters reopened in 1660, well, he's had his critics too, some quite surprising ones.
Who didn't like Shakespeare? I mean, today that seems almost blasphemous.
Well, figures like Voltaire, King George III, Tolstoy, George Bernard Shaw, even the philosopher Wittgenstein, they all had their criticisms. But despite that, Shakespeare's reputation since 1660 has had a continuity that, according to the source, even other giants like Milton haven't quite matched.
So it's not just about whether it's a play or a book, it's something deeper.
It seems to be about the inconstant nature of human tastes, the shifts in cultural priorities, what resonates with different generations. Think about William Blake or Gerard Manley Hopkins, huge figures now, right?
Definitely.
But largely unrecognized in their own lifetimes.
And the reverse happens too, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The source asks, who reads Abraham Cowley today? Apparently the most esteemed poet of the 17th century, or Sir Charles Grandison, the most admired novel of the 18th century.
Exactly. Giants in their day, now mostly footnotes for specialists. The source does suggest, maybe, that the mountain range of English poetry thinking, Chaucer, Milton, Wordsworth, seems a little more durable in reputation than prose. Perhaps poetry's intensity helps it travel across time a bit better.
Interesting thought. And it's not just individual authors, but entire forms of writing that rise and fall.
Oh, absolutely. Whole genres have had their day in the sun and then faded. Sermons, for example. Hugely powerful, popular, considered major literary achievements from the Middle Ages right into the 19th century.
Hard to imagine now, but yeah.
Now, not so much in literary studies. The essay was massive in the 18th century, but maybe less dominant now.
And the novel, it had to fight its way up.
It certainly did. Romance kind of lost ground to the novel in the 18th century, and it took a while for the novel to be taken seriously by critics. And drama, interestingly, only became truly respectable as literature, something to be read and studied, after the Restoration in 1660.
Even more recently, the source points out that literary biography really took off in the 1980s.
Yeah, ironically, right when some literary theorists were arguing the author was dead or irrelevant.
And nonfiction's had a bumpy ride, too. Bertrand Russell and Winston Churchill won Nobel Prizes in the 50s for their nonfiction writing, seen as literature.
But then, the source notes, nonfiction sort of drifted out of focus for literature students in Britain, although there are efforts now to bring it back, sometimes for reasons beyond pure literary merit.
Okay, so the big takeaway here seems to be that literary history isn't some static, dusty list. It's dynamic. Reputations shift. Forms change constantly. Understanding that helps us see contemporary literature in a new light, maybe question our own assumptions about what's great or enduring.
It gives you a critical lens, absolutely. When you read something celebrated today, you can ask, does it have those qualities that have historically allowed work to last? Or is it maybe tied more closely to current tastes that might just fade? Food for thought. Okay, let's rewind the clock way back to the very beginnings, the Old English period, roughly 450 to 1150 AD. This is where the English language and its literature are just starting to emerge. And it starts, really, with deep oral roots. The source introduces us to Cædmon. Bede presents him as the first person we know of who used English oral composition poetry for sacred stories for religious subjects. It seems the English really took to verse right from the start.
Yeah, Bede tells that amazing story about Cædmon. He was, an unlearned older farmhand at Whitby Abbey?
That's right, under St. Hilda.
He couldn't compose poetry, apparently, and would duck out of feasts when the harp came around for people to sing. But then one night, sleeping in the stable, a voice commands him to sing about creation, and suddenly he can. It's presented as this miraculous, divine gift.
A powerful origin story for English Christian poetry. The source also mentions other early writers like Aldhelm and Bede himself, who wrote in both Latin and Old English.
And we start to see some key surviving works from this period, like The Dream of the Rood. What's that about?
It's a vision poem, a dream poem. It's part of a wider tradition of venerating the cross, which spread after Emperor Constantine's vision and his mother Helena supposedly finding fragments of the true cross.
And there's a tangible link, isn't there?
Yes, a fascinating detail. A fragment of the cross, given by the Pope to King Alfred, ended up in the Brussels reliquary. And it's actually inscribed with a verse from this very poem, The Dream of the Rood.
Wow, that really connects the poem to history. It reflects how much writing then was religious, devotional. Stories of saints, Bible stories.
And the liturgy, the words used in church services, was incredibly important. It wasn't just a source for poems like one called Christ. It was really how most people encountered the Bible stories. Translations into English actually started very early. Bede translated Gospels around 735. Elfric parts of the Old Testament around 1020. Bits and pieces of several Old English versions survive.
But the big one, the epic everyone's heard of, is Beowulf.
The great surviving heroic epic. The source suggests it was maybe composed around 909, though dating is tricky. It's this amazing story of heroes, monsters, kingship. It starts with the mysterious arrival of Scyld as a foundling who becomes a great king.
And his descendant, Hrothgar, builds the famous hall, Heorot. But then the monster Grendel attacks.
Right, Grendel, who seems to resent the music and feasting, the sounds of community. He starts killing Hrothgar's warriors.
Until Beowulf arrives from Geatland. He fights Grendel in the hall hand to hand and wins. But it's not over.
No, Grendel's mother seeks revenge. Beowulf has to follow her down to this terrifying underwater lair and kill her, the poem says, with God's help.
And the story jumps forward, doesn't it, to Beowulf as an old king?
Yes. In his old age, he faces a final challenge. A dragon guarding a treasure hoard, angered because someone stole a cup. Beowulf fights it, is mortally wounded, but kills the dragon with help from a young loyal supporter, Wiglaf.
And the poem ends quite somberly, with prophecies of doom for Beowulf's people, the Geats, and his funeral pyre.
It's a powerful mix of heroic action, pagan fatalism, and interestingly, the source notes it also contains biblical allusions, similar perhaps to The Dream of the Rood.
So you have this really vibrant, verse-heavy literature in Old English, drawing on native heroic stuff and Christian themes, and then bang! The Norman Conquest, 1066, a massive disruption.
Huge. It fundamentally changed everything for English literature and the language itself. Literature in English took a massive hit. That classical Old English alliterative verse basically died out for centuries. Prose carried on, mainly sermons and things like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle kept up in monasteries.
But when English writing really comes back, it's different, almost a new language.
Very different, for a few key reasons. First, the strong written standard based on the Wessex dialect, centered around Winchester, disappeared with the shift in power. Scribes started writing things down in their own local dialects.
So chaos.
Pretty much. The source calls it a bewildering variety in spelling, grammar, word forms. Plus, the language itself was changing rapidly, losing endings like the final E. It was in constant flux for about 400 years.
And on top of all that, the rulers spoke French.
Exactly. The aristocracy, the court, spoke Norman French. Educated people were often trilingual English, French, Latin. Many households were bilingual. This mixing pot, this lack of a single standard, is what shapes Middle English, the language of the period from roughly 1150 to 1500.
And in Middle English, we see the rise of what's called courtly literature, reflecting that more layered society.
Yes, the gap between the knight, the chevalier, and the commoner, the villain, becomes much wider, more fixed, hereditary. So literature developed specifically for the court, for this French-speaking or bilingual elite. They loved romances of antiquity, tales of Thebes, Troy, Alexander the Great, the matter of Rome, the source calls it.
Like Benoit de Saint-Maur's huge Roman de Troyes.
Exactly, written for Eleanor of Aquitaine's court. These often featured incredible marvels, or sometimes took a different angle on classical stories, like focusing on Dido and the Aeneas tales.
But even more popular, especially with the ladies, were the Arthurian stories, the matter of Britain.
Oh yes. Chaucer has his nuns priests swear his tale is as true as is the book of Lancelot de Lake, that women hold in full Greek reverence. That line tells you a lot about the cultural cachet of Arthurian romance at court.
The influence of French literature seems really clear in the poetry, the lyrics of this time too.
Absolutely. The nightingale becomes the bird of love, a motif straight from 12th century Provençal lyrics in southern France. And the whole concept of courtly love poetry, transferring the kind of feudal service a knight owed his lord to his chosen lady, that wasn't something you found in classical literature.
So even if English lyrics didn't quite match the originals, those themes are there.
Definitely. You hear echoes of birdsong and courtly devotion in early 14th century lyrics like those in the Harley manuscript, poems like Alison, which vividly describes spring and the birds singing.
But it wasn't all courtly love. There were also incredibly powerful spiritual writers in Middle English.
Yes, figures like Richard Rolle, Walter Hilton, and especially Julian of Norwich. She lived from about 1343 to maybe 1413 or even later. The source gives some extracts that show her intense focus on core Christian teachings and this remarkably pure, direct style.
She describes seeing Christ suffering with these incredibly vivid, almost physical details, like blood falling like raindrops off eaves or like herring scales.
Or Christ, hanging like a cloth put out to dry, his flesh wrinkled and brown like dry wood.
It's quite startling imagery.
It is, and it accompanies these profound spiritual insights. Christ's wound being large enough for all mankind to be saved. And her famous, deeply comforting words, "All shape be well, and all manner of things shape be well. All shall be well."
And her sense of Christ's presence and compassion, and Christ saying, I it am, that is all.
It all comes from her core belief, as she put it. Our life is all grounded and rooted in love, and without love, we may not live. The source rightly notes these short extracts only hint at the richness of her showings and her place in that whole mystical tradition.
Okay, moving into the later part of the Middle English period, the late 14th, 15th centuries, we encounter John Gower.
A contemporary and friend of Chaucer's. A gentleman landowner, interesting because he wrote major works in 3 different languages, French, Latin, and English. His English work, Confessio Amantis, or The Lover's Confession, is the most famous and survives in quite a few manuscripts.
And he and Chaucer clearly respected each other.
Yes, the source mentions Chaucer submitted his Troilus and Creside to Gower for correction, and in Gower's poem, Venus tells the narrator to greet Chaucer as "mi disciple" and "mi poete." They were seen as the leading lights of English poetry then, printed together later by Caxton.
But the name that just towers over Middle English literature is Geoffrey Chaucer, right? Around 1343 to 1400.
Undeniably. The Canterbury Tales is the huge one, of course, but he wrote a lot of impressive stuff before that. Dream visions were a really important form for him.
Like the Book of the Duchess, where the narrator dreams he meets a man mourning his dead wife.
Exactly. A very sensitive handling of grief. And then there's the Parliament of Fowls, which is just brilliant in how it mixes different genres. You got philosophy, a love vision, animal fable, a debate, all supposedly sparked by reading a book before falling asleep.
And Chaucer presents himself quite humorously, doesn't he? As a bookworm who's a bit clueless about love.
Yeah, sort of the owl who'll never be a nightingale.
Mm.
It's a very different persona from serious dreamers like Dante, seeking divine enlightenment. Chaucer seems to suggest that reading books isn't enough when it comes to love. You actually need someone to love.
So Parliament explores love from different angles.
Yes. The source highlights how it contrasts the noble eagles with their drawn-out courtship, the down-to-earth farmyard birds who see love as purely physical, the Temple of Venus representing idealized sexual pleasure, and Scipio's dream suggesting love of the common good is the path to immortality. Chaucer lays out these complex, often contradictory views of love, suggesting maybe human nature is unreasonable and love is a puzzle, especially if you take it too seriously. It was incredibly fresh and elegant for its time.
And Chaucer even pokes fun at himself and the whole idea of literary competition within the Canterbury Tales, right?
Absolutely, that's part of his genius. He has himself, as a pilgrim, tell 2 tales. First, Sir Tulpus, which is this deliberately terrible parody of the popular, often clunky tale rhyme romances of the day full of nonsense and bad rhymes.
And the host, the pub landlord character, completely misses the joke and just shuts him down, saying his rhyming is not worth a turd.
Exactly. It's hilarious meta-commentary. And then Chaucer, the character, immediately switches to telling this very long, very moral prose fable, Melody. It shows his incredible range. The source talks about his Gothic switches in genre and tone, reflecting this really comprehensive view of life, physical, social, moral, spiritual, shown from all sorts of angles. And then his final retractions, where he seems to take back some of his more worldly works, adds another fascinating layer.
Then there's Sir Thomas Malory, crucial for giving us the Arthurian story in the form we mostly know it.
Yes. His Le Morte d'Arthur, finished around 1471 and printed by Caxton, is the classic version. The source uses the story of Elaine, the Lady of Shalott, as an example of his style. After Lancelot rejects her, she dies of grief and her body is put in a barge that floats down the Thames.
And that description.
It's so vivid and strange. And their hit rubbed and rolled to and fro a great while before ony a man speed hit. That rhythm, that slightly unsettling image, shows his prose mastery. He creates this world that's both magical and strangely everyday, with dramatic scenes and a larger narrative sweep.
And the source emphasizes the context he was writing in.
Right. After England had lost the 100 Years' War, during the brutal Wars of the Roses, which Malory himself fought in, he knew the kind of chivalry he was writing about in the tales of Gareth or Tristram or the Grail Quest wasn't really around anymore.
So the book has this elegiac quality, a lament for a lost ideal.
Very much so. It builds towards the tragic breakup of the Round Table, Arthur's death, the feuds triggered by Lancelot and Guinevere. Mallory, a Lancastrian supporter, even includes a lament about the English character.
Oh,
Yeah,
lovely.
this is a great default of us English seamen, for there may no thing just please, no term for long. He feels Arthur loses because Lancelot isn't there.
And the ending is just full of betrayal and sorrow, isn't it? Even Sir Bedwere lying to the dying Arthur about throwing Excalibur into the lake.
Yes, Arthur calls him a traitor. And Bedware's cry after putting Arthur in the barge to Avilion, my Lord Arthur, what shall become of me? Now ye go from me, and love me here alone among mine enemies, is heartbreaking. And of course the famous inscription supposedly on Arthur's tomb, Hic iasit Arthurus, rex quondam refsque futuris. Here lies Arthur, the once and future king. That adds the layer of myth and hope.
One last figure mentioned from the tail end of this period, Gavin Douglas, a Scottish bishop who translated Virgil's Aeneid.
Yes, the first full version in English, actually Scots English. While the translation itself is maybe neglected, the source highlights his original prologues to each book. They're apparently incredibly vivid, full of detail about Scottish language and landscape, bringing a kind of northern realism to the classical epic.
Like describing bundling up in winter.
Exactly. Putting on Clathus Thrinfald 3 layers for it to expel the perilous Bersandcald, or observing cranes flying south in autumn. These concrete details show a fascinating merging of the classical and the contemporary Scottish world.
Okay, so that takes us through Old and Middle English. Now we hit a period of massive change. The Renaissance and the Reformation, roughly 1500 to 1660.
A hugely transformative era. You have the Renaissance spreading from Italy across Europe, while Italy's Renaissance is famous for art. The Northern Renaissance, maybe except for the Low Countries, was perhaps more intellectual, more focused on texts and ideas, and it was profoundly shaped by the Reformation.
The Reformation kicks off with Martin Luther in 1517, a fundamental shift in authority.
Yes, it's described as a gradual, but ultimately sudden, transfer away from central communal authority like the Catholic Church towards more local individual authority, away from external ritual towards internal conscience. Europe splits into Catholic and Protestant states.
And in England, it gets tangled up with Henry VIII's personal life. He was initially anti-Luther, wasn't he? Wrote a book defending the sacraments.
He did, and got the title Defender of the Faith from the Pope for it, a title still on British coins. But his desire for a divorce from Catherine of Aragon led him to break with Rome, declare himself supreme head of the Church of England in 1533.
And Sir Thomas More, who'd helped write that anti-Luther book, couldn't accept it.
No, More resigned as chancellor, refused the oath of supremacy, and was executed in 1535, a dramatic illustration of the conflict. Then came the suppression of monasteries and religious houses, radically shifting wealth and power. The source quotes that little rhyme. Hops, heresy, bays, and beer came into England all in one year, capturing the sense of sudden, widespread change around 1525.
Alongside all this religious turmoil, humanism was taking root in England. But it wasn't anti-religious.
Not at all, often quite the opposite. Early English humanists like John Colet, who founded St. Paul's School, were deeply Christian. Colet wanted boys taught good literature, both Latin and Greek, especially Christian authors, to increase knowledge and worshiping of God.
So it was about using classical learning to deepen Christian understanding.
Precisely. Erasmus, the great European humanist, taught Greek at Cambridge and was close friends with Thomas More. Rhetoric, the art of effective speaking and writing, became a key tool for these new ideals, challenging the older medieval focus on logic and theology.
This period also develops a new ideal of the gentleman, different from the medieval knight.
Yes, think Castiglione's Book of the Courtier. The Renaissance ideal was more consciously Christian, highly educated, skilled in language and diplomacy, a figure of grace and learning, not just fighting prowess or lineage.
And in poetry, we see Sir Thomas Wyatt bringing these new Renaissance forms like the sonnet into English.
Wyatt adapted Petrarchan sonnets. His poems show the English language in transition how. The meter can be a bit rough sometimes because the language was still changing and didn't have a settled poetic rhythm yet. But there's a grave grace, a conscious artistry there that feels new. The source contrasts him with an earlier court poet like John Skelton, who, though a clever satirist, sounds almost like a casual entertainer by comparison.
That Renaissance focus on deliberate, conscious art really comes through.
It does. Wyatt's work, whether it's love poetry or satire or personal reflection, sets a new benchmark for crafted verse.
This era is also absolutely pivotal for the English Bible.
Hugely important. There were Old and Middle English translations, as we mentioned, but the drive to translate directly from the original Greek and Hebrew really gained momentum with the Reformation. William Tyndale is a key figure here, translating the New Testament while in exile, eventually martyred for his work in 1536. A tremendous sacrifice.
Miles Coverdale produced the first complete printed English Bible in 1535, and then the Great Bible was placed in churches in 1540. But the version with the biggest long-term literary impact
Was undoubtedly the authorized version, or King James Version, of 1611. Its language, its rhythms, its phrases became deeply embedded in English culture and influenced writers for centuries. It was a massive collaborative effort, building on the work of Tyndale, Coverdale, and others.
Drama was also changing quickly during this time. The old mystery and morality plays were still around.
Yes, mysteries were performed even into Shakespeare's day. The source suggests characters like Falstaff or Shylock might owe something to the mischievous vice figure from the moralities characters, who often entertain the audience before being defeated. But traveling professional companies, performing in inns or noble houses like we see in Hamlet, became more central.
And shorter plays, interludes performed during banquets were also popular.
All setting the stage for the incredible burst of talent in the Elizabethan era, the later 16th century. The source calls it, after the fallow, the flower.
What a great phrase, and what a generation. Spenser, Raleigh, Sidney, Lilly, Hooker. Then Marlowe and Shakespeare born in the same year, 1564, followed by Donne and Johnson in 1572.
It's an astonishing concentration of talent. They really defined English literature for the next phase, building on the foundations laid earlier in the century.
And they brought a new level of conscious artistry and metrical skill.
Yes, building on Wyatt's experiments. Figures like Philip Sidney and Edmund Spenser, products of the new humanist schools, really exemplify this conscious art, this formal perfection. Remember, Middle English instability had made consistent meter tricky. Poets, after Chaucer, often struggled. It was Sidney and his circle who really helped reestablish a firm metrical basis for English verse. They kind of rediscovered the music that had been lost.
Philip Sidney himself seems like the poster child for the Renaissance ideal: courtier, soldier, scholar, poet.
He really was. His prose romance, Arcadia, is known for its incredibly elaborate style, its rhetoric. But the source points out it also has a sense of fun, alongside its serious themes about virtue and love. And his poems, like Astrophil and Stella, showed amazing virtuosity in meter and form, hugely influential.
Edmund Spenser had even grander ambitions, right? To write the great English national epic.
Absolutely. A Puritan, but also a humanist scholar, he wanted to rival, even overgo, the great Italian Renaissance epics, like Ariosto's Orlando Furioso. His massive poem, The Faerie Queen, aimed to create an English mythology, linking the Tudor monarchs back to King Arthur, presenting Arthur as the ultimate British hero, all within the framework of chivalric romance.
And Queen Elizabeth herself seems to loom over the poem.
Yes, sometimes as this powerful, perhaps demanding fairy queen figure, Gloriana, whom the poem's knights serve. It's like a complex, politicized version of courtly love ideals woven into an epic structure.
The Fairy Queen is seen as the poetic monument of the age, right? Full of musicality, imagery, complex ideas.
Definitely. Though he also wrote lovely shorter works wedding hymns like Prothalamion and Epithalamion, known for their musical energy, and beautiful sonnets and amoretti, like the famous One Day I Wrote Her Name Upon the Strand. But the epic is his major historical contribution.
But not everyone was a fan of his style. Ben Jonson had that harsh criticism.
In Affecting the Ancients, he writ no language.
Yeah.
And Sidney himself had criticized the deliberately archaic, old, rustic language Spenser used in his earlier Shepherd's Calendar. The humanist critics valued decorum matching style to subject and preferred classical elegance to what they saw as Spenser's outdated Gothic style.
Kind of ironic, then, that later poets associated with Gothic revival actually loved and imitated his Spenserian stanza.
Very ironic. Thomson, Wordsworth, Byron, Keats, they all used it. Shows how tastes change. Spenser wanted that antique feel. Johnson saw it's fake.
Walter Raleigh is another key figure from Elizabeth's court explorer, courtier, poet.
A fascinating, flamboyant figure. His poetry is often quite direct, morally pointed, like in that poem telling the court it glows but does no good. Pretty bold for a courtier.
And his life ended dramatically. Imprisoned, released for a doomed expedition to find El Dorado, then executed.
His poems written in the Tower of London, like Even Such His Time, show a depth beyond just courtly games. They connect back to the moral seriousness of earlier Tudor poetry, but in simpler, more direct language, a resilient spirit.
Okay, this brings us right to the doorstep of the giants of the English stage. Shakespeare and his contemporaries, moving into the Jacobean period under King James the Serve.
William Shakespeare. Arrives in London around 1590, age about 28, right when this wave of new poetic drama is cresting. Kidd and Marlowe die relatively young, and suddenly the stage is kind of his.
He was incredibly prolific, 2 plays a year for 20 years.
Roughly, yeah. He mastered comedy. History basically perfected the English history play, then tragedy, and finally the late plays we call romances. He retired relatively early, and it's sobering to think half his plays might have been lost if friends like Ben Jonson hadn't collected them in the first folio after his death.
His background in Stratford, son of a tradesman and a landowner's daughter, grammar school education focused on Latin and rhetoric, seems fairly typical for the time.
Reasonably so, yes. The source emphasizes how he learned from everything. Nature, town life, traveling actors, maybe even the old Coventry mystery plays performed nearby.
And it mentions the possibility of hidden Catholic sympathies. A church peepist.
Oh, it raises the possibility, yes. Notes that nothing recorded contradicts it. His daughter maybe didn't take communion once, which was noted after the gunpowder plot. Later rumors said he died a papist. It's speculation, but the source does argue his plays show a positive Christian understanding mixed with questioning of Renaissance humanism and are full of symbolism, not the anti-symbolic bent of some Reformation theology.
Yeah.
Whatever his personal faith, he was clearly a successful businessman in the theater world.
His early plays covered a huge range, didn't they? From bawdy comedy like Taming of the Shrew to Roman gore in Titus Andronicus and patriotic history in Henry VI.
Absolutely. And his early comedies already blended action with really sophisticated wordplay and high spirits. The theater scene itself was very diverse, rowdy public playhouses, quieter private ones, but drawing huge mixed crowds, which gave the drama enormous cultural influence.
His contemporary, Christopher Marlowe, born the same year, is known for these incredibly ambitious, often defiant protagonists. Tamburlaine, Dr. Faustus.
Marlowe's heroes really push against human limits. Tamburlaine is about a shepherd who rises to rule an empire through sheer will and brutality. Dr. Faustus. Well, the source argues against the later romantic view of Faustus as some kind of noble striver.
How so?
It suggests Marlowe's Faustus doesn't really believe in hell, sells his soul for 24 years of pretty trivial pleasures and power, seeks shallow knowledge, and wastes his magic on practical jokes. Less a tragic hero, more a cautionary tale about pride and foolishness.
So more like the old morality plays where the sinner gets his comeuppance.
The source points out those influences, yeah. The good and evil angels, the devil's coming for him at the end.
Yeah.
It fits that older pattern.
Okay, back to Shakespeare. The source touches on specific plays, like Love's Labour's Lost.
Calls it a conceited comedy, meaning very witty, based on cleverness and language. It's so focused on wordplay and intellectual games that the sudden arrival of news of a death at the end is a real shock. Action undercuts words. And it introduces Rosaline, seen as an early example of the sharp, insightful Shakespearean heroine, who often sees things more clearly than the men professing love.
And the play suggests love involves a kind of necessary folly, making mistakes to learn.
Yes, captured in Byron's line about needing to lose our oaths to find ourselves. The source also mentions his long narrative poems based on Ovid, Venus and Adonis, and the Rape of Lucrece.
How are they viewed?
Venus and Adonis, about the goddess pursuing the reluctant youth, is seen as maybe finding it hard to be entirely serious, leading towards playful erotic comedy. Lucrece, the tragic story of rape and suicide, is considered more successful, especially in depicting the rapist Tarquin's mental state beforehand. That phrase, Tarquin's ravishing strides, even gets echoed in Macbeth.
And the sonnets, published in 1609, a major sequence.
Huge. Adapting the continental sonnet tradition, they seem to tell a story, though unconventional, involving a beautiful young man, the fair youth, and a mysterious dark lady. Publication might have been unauthorized, but perhaps desired by Shakespeare.
The poems to the young man start by urging him to marry and have children.
To preserve his beauty. But then the poet claims his verse will make the young man immortal. However, the young man's behavior doesn't match his beauty. He seems to betray the poet's idealized love. The poet's feelings shift from devotion to disillusionment and disgust. Lilies that fester smell far worse than weeds.
And the sequence ends unusually.
Sonnet 126 has only 12 lines, not 14. The source interprets this as the poet finally abandoning the claim that poetry can truly conquer time and death, a sobering conclusion.
Then we come to the great tragedies. Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, Macbeth.
Defining works. They don't all fit a neat formula, but they share a noble protagonist caught in some terrible situation, ending in death. Hamlet's famous "The time is out of joint" line sums up that tragic mismatch. He's a sensitive, intellectual prince in a corrupt, violent world.
King Lear is highlighted as a profound struggle between good and evil.
a play that resists despair, even in its darkness. The source mentions Dr. Johnson's criticism of Cordelia's death, arguing against him that while Cordelia perishes, her virtue does not. It suggests Shakespeare leaves the audience contemplating profound questions at the very edge of life and death.
And the late plays, the romances, like The Tempest.
A different mood again. Often based on original stories, sometimes observing the classical unities of time and place, which he mostly ignored earlier. The Tempest features Prospero, who educates his daughter Miranda but fails with Caliban, suggesting some natures resist nurture.
Prospero uses magic to test his shipwrecked enemies. Some repent, others don't.
Right. Alonso repents, but Prospero's brother Antonio and Sebastian remain cynical villains, like Spencer's Grill, who chose to stay a pig. They even plan to exhibit Caliban for money.
But Caliban himself shows some capacity for change.
Yes, interestingly, after being tested and failing, he resolves to be wise hereafter and seek for grace, unlike the unrepentant nobles. Prospero finally renounces his magic, prepares to return to Milan and his dukedom, contemplating his own mortality. Every third thought shall be my grave.
Ben Jonson, Shakespeare's friend and rival, is also a major figure.
Absolutely. He wrote that famous tribute loving Shakespeare, this side idolatry, but also, frankly, noted his flaws, small Latin and less Greek, sometimes careless writing. Jonson himself was highly educated, a soldier, had a tumultuous life involving a duel, converting to Catholicism for a time, being questioned after the gunpowder plot.
A big personality, known for his moral satire.
Yes, and his plays like Volpone or The Alchemist are masterpieces of sharp, detailed satire, exposing the greed and folly of London society.
After these two giants, Jacobean tragedy continued, often exploring darker themes. Webster's The Duchess of Malfi.
Consider the best of the revenge tragedies. A powerful female protagonist, secretly married, persecuted by her corrupt brothers, driven towards madness, but facing death with dignity. Her brother's line after she's strangled, "Cover her face, mine eyes dazzle, she died young," is unforgettable.
The popularity of these dark plays is interesting. Why were people so fascinated by human evil?
The source speculates it might reflect a society where old certainties about human nature had been shaken by decades of religious upheaval. Catholicism, Protestantism under Edward VI, Catholicism again under Mary, then Elizabeth's settlement. Different theologies offered very different views. Aquinas, seeing man as good but stupid, Luther as bad but clever. Calvin's doctrine of predestination suggesting most were damned gaining ground under James I. Perhaps this uncertainty fueled the tragic explorations. However, the source also suggests some of this Jacobean pessimism feels a bit overwrought today.
Okay, shifting from the stage to poetry in the early 17th century, John Donne is crucial.
Yes. Though known publicly as a powerful preacher, his poetry circulated mainly in manuscript and was published after his death. 20th century critics really rediscovered his love poems, The Sun Rising, The Good Morrow, and his religious verse, the Holy Sonnets.
His style is very distinctive, isn't it? Dramatic, argumentative.
The source describes it as arguing aloud, using theatrical techniques, compressions, startling comparisons, conceits, and paradox to explore complex emotional and intellectual states. Like in Good Friday, 1613, where he's riding west, but his soul is pulled east towards the crucifixion.
Sir Thomas Browne is another fascinating prose writer from this time.
An Anglican doctor, but deeply religious. He combined scientific observation with a profound sense of mystery. He respected evidence, but distrusted pure reason, saying, "I love to lose myself in a mystery, to pursue my reason to an altitudo." Oh, the height. He had a remarkable tolerance, weeping at Catholic services others mocked, believing no one can truly judge another because no one truly knows another.
This era also boasts major devotional poets, George Herbert.
Yes, from a prominent family, he became a humble village parson. His poems, collected in the temple, made him almost an Anglican saint. They often use simple, homely language and imagery addressed directly and intimately to God, to Christ as a person you could speak with.
A kind of intimacy that became rarer later.
The source suggests so. Compared to Milton, where God seems more remote, needing nothing from humans. Herbert's simplicity wasn't simple-mindedness. He was a highly educated Cambridge orator who deliberately studied the plain style of the parables. Words danced for him. His poem Prayer ends with that incredible cascade of metaphors. The Milky Way, the bird of paradise, church bells beyond the stars heard, the soul's blood, something understood.
And then John Milton, the towering figure. Blindness deeply impacted his later work.
Absolutely. His sonnet, "When I Consider How My Light Is Spent," poignantly expresses his fear that blindness makes his talent useless, questioning if God still expects work. The answer he receives internally is that God doesn't need human works.
Yeah.
Service can also be simply bearing the affliction to stand and wait.
His invocation at the start of Book 3 of Paradise Lost is intensely personal about his blindness.
Yes, lamenting the loss of daylight, the changing seasons he can no longer see, the human face divine. In Paradise Lost, he undertakes that monumental task to justify the ways of God to men, retelling the story of the fall to demonstrate divine justice.
The source calls it the greatest English poem in terms of art, power, and scope. Even Dr. Johnson, who wasn't a fan of Milton's politics or religion, hugely admired its execution.
Its grandeur, its energy, its intricate structure, encompassing vast knowledge. It's a monumental achievement, especially for a blind poet composing and dictating it.
Okay, moving forward again. We enter the Restoration and the 18th century, from about 1660 to 1798, a new political landscape after the Civil War.
Yes, the monarchy restored with Charles II in 1660, but then the bloodless revolution of 1688 removes his Catholic brother James II. Parliament asserts more power, excluding Catholics from the throne. Power becomes more balanced between Crown, Parliament, and the growing influence of London's commercial interests.
And the literature reflects this changing society.
It does. The tone becomes less court-centered, more geared towards a polite society, defined by rank, property, money. New ideas circulate widely through journals and coffee houses. Books become much more commonplace by 1700.
This period is often labeled Augustanism, right? After the Roman Emperor Augustus, implying order, reason, classical imitation.
Exactly. Roughly from Dryden's prime until Pope's death in 1744, though some extend the 18th century sensibility longer. The dominant verse form becomes the neat, balanced, rhymed pentameter couplet.
Like Pope's famous lines on Isaac Newton.
Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, "Let Newton be," and all was light. Perfectly captures that confidence in reason and scientific discovery.
What about drama during the Restoration?
Shakespeare remained popular, but was often heavily adapted, cut, and rewritten to fit new tastes influenced by French dramatists like Corneille and Racine and neoclassical critical rules, like the three unities of action, place, and time, which Shakespeare had cheerfully ignored.
John Dryden is seen as the central literary figure of the early part of this era.
Yes, he consciously aimed to build an English Augustanism. He saw translating classics, like his hugely successful version of Virgil's Aeneid, as a way to refine and cultivate the English language itself, similar to how Latin was cultivated through Greek translation in Rome. His translation showed the heroic couplet could achieve real grandeur.
This period is also broadly known as the Enlightenment. What does that mean in this context?
It signifies a phase after the Renaissance, characterized by a strong belief in the power and universal authority of reason. The idea that reason could understand, explain, and ultimately improve the world. This generally led to favoring religious toleration, moderation, and a hopeful outlook on human perfectibility through rationality.
But it wasn't necessarily anti-religious.
Not always in England. While figures like Voltaire in France leaned towards deism, or Hume in Scotland towards skepticism, outright atheism was rare among major English writers. Edward Gibbon, the historian, is mentioned as one exception. The Enlightenment ideal maybe fits France and Scotland better than England, where figures like Swift were deeply critical of oversimplified rationalism.
Yeah, you had Shaftesbury arguing enlightened self-interest leads to public good, which Swift scorned. And Mandeville argued self-interest leads purely to competition.
Contrasting views on human nature persisted. A key development in prose was the rise of the periodical essay, Addison and Steele with the Tatler and the Spectator.
What was their aim?
To popularize knowledge and philosophy, to bring it out of academic closets and into everyday life clubs, coffee houses, tea tables. Addison famously wanted his paper to be part of the tea equipage. They aimed to cultivate minds, refine manners, and gently satirize folly.
Jonathan Swift stands out as a towering, complex figure from this period, an Anglo-Irish churchman deeply involved in politics.
Yes, born in Dublin, became Dean of St. Patrick's there, often lived in opposition to the London government, defending Irish interests and the Anglican Church, despite wanting preferment in England. He was a brilliant, often ferocious satirist.
His satires often use shocking logic, don't they? Like an argument to prove that the abolishing of Christianity.
Exactly. He adopts the persona of a cold pragmatist to argue for Christianity, suggesting its removal might cause some inconveniences. It's a defense of religion based on its social utility, coming from someone who deeply believed it was necessary for more profound reasons.
And a modest proposal is the ultimate example of that technique.
Devastatingly so. Proposing that the starving Irish sell their babies as food for the rich, it uses the cold, detached language of economic calculation to expose the horrifying inhumanity of treating the poor as mere statistics or commodities. His final claim of disinterestedness, having no young children himself, makes it even more chilling. The source calls it prophetic of later callousness.
Gulliver's Travels uses